Savannah had always been more than capable. She ran a high-end event planning firm in San Francisco, juggling million-dollar budgets and clients with egos the size of small countries. But at home in front of her father, all that success seemed to vanish. It didn't matter how many awards she won or how much money she made. She was still his little girl expected to bend to his will. Years of conditioning had turned her into someone who sought his approval with every decision, every task, hoping for a glance of acknowledgement. But deep down, Savannah knew, no matter what she did, she'd never quite earn the recognition she craved. Her story begins on a frigid day at the family estate, where the fight for her dignity would finally begin. Savannah stood frozen in the biting cold, the weight of her father's words pressing against her chest as he shoved the crumpled bag into her hands. The air was crisp and harsh, 10 degrees below zero, but his words were colder, cutting through her like a knife. She looked at the black polyester catering uniform, the cheap fabric, a stark contrast to the tailored suits she wore every day at work, the outfits that made her feel powerful and in control. But here at her father's estate, none of that mattered. "Elena's family is inside," he said, glancing at his watch as if she wasn't even standing there. "They're elevated people. We can't have your desperate single girl energy ruining the aesthetic at the main table. Use the service entrance." She wanted to scream, to throw the uniform back at him and walk away, but instead she stood there holding the apron in her hands, numb. Her father didn't look at her as he turned, walking away with a sense of finality, leaving her there in the cold alone. It wasn't the first time he had treated her like this. It wasn't even the 100th time. But today, the sting was sharper than ever. She was the woman who built a high-end event planning firm from the ground up. Someone who balanced multi-million-dollar budgets and oversaw luxury events. She knew how to handle ego's negotiations and the smallest details that made or broke an event. But none of that mattered here, not in her father's eyes. To him, she wasn't Savannah, the successful entrepreneur. She wasn't the woman who had risen above every obstacle in her path. She was just his daughter, and right now, she was the help. She had to walk through the service entrance just like the rest of the staff. She clenched her jaw, willing herself not to cry. But inside, something broke. Her father had never looked at her with pride or admiration. He had always treated her like a tool, an extension of himself that it could be used and discarded at will. He hadn't raised a daughter. He had trained a servant. For years, she had worked hard to earn his approval, pouring herself into everything he asked of her, even when it meant sacrificing pieces of herself. But no matter how much she gave, it was never enough. Standing there with that ridiculous apron, Savannah realized that the pain wasn't just from the physical cold, it was from the emotional frostbite she'd been suffering for as long as she could remember. Every success she had in her career, every accomplishment was diminished by the look of disappointment in his eyes when she didn't meet his expectations. She had spent years trying to prove herself, trying to show him that she wasn't just a daughter to be dismissed, but a woman to be respected. And every time she failed. She walked through the service entrance, the heavy steel door shutting behind her with a definitive thud. The warmth of the kitchen felt like a cruel joke. The gleaming stainless steel counters the marble floors. It was all so pristine, so cold, and yet it was supposed to be her mother's legacy. Her mother who had bought this estate just 3 years before. She passed leaving Savannah to inherit nothing but a broken relationship with her father and a kitchen filled with reminders of what she could never have. She began unpacking the crates of food she had purchased herself. The tomahawk steaks, truffle butter and vintage Cabernet, the $8,500 she had charged to her personal card, because Richard had claimed his liquidity was tied up in the engagement ring. She was the one who had driven for hours, sourced everything with her own hands. And yet, here she was, packing up a spread of luxury food that wasn't even meant for her. And then Aunt Monica marched in like a storm cloud demanding perfection. She barely spared Savannah a glance, instead choosing to criticize everything from the timing of the prep to the decor. Monica's voice dripped with condescension. "You're late starting the prep. Elena's parents are already judging the decor. We need this to go smoothly, Savannah. Your father's under enough stress." Stress. Savannah couldn't help but laugh, though it wasn't a laugh at all. "I paid for the steak, Monica," she said, her knife hitting the cutting board with an angry thud. But Monica, unbothered, fired back with the usual line, "And he raised you alone. He sacrificed everything for you after your mother passed. The least you can do is ensure he's happy today." It wasn't the first time someone had said this to her, and it would hardly be the last. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation, one that had been placed on her shoulders since she was a child. For years she had wondered why she did it, why she always came back, always gave more, always put herself second. She used to think it was kindness, that she was simply a good person. But as she stood there slicing lemons for a party she wasn't even allowed to attend, she finally understood the real reason she had been conditioned, manipulated into believing her worth was tied to her ability to give, to serve, to remain invisible. She wasn't here because she loved her family. She was here because she was addicted to their approval, and that addiction had been built over 20 years of emotional manipulation. The cruelty had been normalized so slowly that she hadn't even noticed it until now. Aunt Monica stormed into the kitchen without so much as a greeting, her eyes immediately scanning the counter for flaws. She didn't see Savannah standing there cutting the lemons with a steady hand, or the effort it took to swallow her frustration. Monica's gaze flicked over the spread of food, her frown deepening. "You're late starting the prep," she snapped, her voice sharp. "Elena's parents are already judging the decor. We need this to go smoothly, Savannah. Your father's under enough stress." There it was. The familiar weight of guilt dropped on her shoulders like an anchor. Stress. Savannah could hardly keep herself from laughing. She had never known anyone to equate stress with the casual cruelty her father exuded. But Monica wasn't finished. She stepped closer, crossing her arms as she looked down on Savannah and delivered the well-worn line that always made Savannah feel small. "He raised you alone. He sacrificed everything for you after your mother passed. The least you can do is ensure he's happy today." Monica's words hit like an old wound reopening. That same guilt, that same blame. Savannah had heard it from her father, from Monica, from almost everyone. Over the years, it had become impossible to escape. She was never just the daughter. She was the burden that her father had carried all these years, the weight he bore alone. And now, in Monica's eyes, the weight was hers to carry too. But this time, Savannah's response was different. The knife in her hand slammed into the cutting board with a sharp, angry thud. "I paid for the steak, Monica." She said the words, escaping before she could stop them. The truth was sharp and bitter, the taste of years of resentment on her tongue. Monica didn't flinch. Instead, she returned fire with the same worn-out argument. And he raised you alone. He sacrificed everything for you after your mother passed. Monica's voice took on a sanctimonious tone as she pressed. The least you can do is ensure he's happy today. Don't be so transactional. Transactional. The word lingered between them, heavy and ironic. Savannah stood frozen, her mind racing. For years, she had tried to make sense of why she kept doing this, why she kept showing up, writing checks bearing the weight of these demands. She had once thought it was out of kindness that her willingness to give was a sign of a good heart. But as the words, "Don't be so transactional," echoed in her mind, the truth started to settle in her. Kindness had been manipulated. She wasn't here out of genuine love or care. She was here because she'd been trained to think her value was something she had to earn. The cycle of emotional manipulation, the withholding of praise until she performed the endless guilt trips, it had all been designed to keep her obedient, to make her believe that she had to prove her worth with every action. This was no longer about being a good person. This was about surviving a system of normalized cruelty. Over the years, the cruelty had become so embedded in her life that she didn't even recognize it for what it was until now. It was as if she had been numb to the constant emotional draining until this moment when everything clicked. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because her father's approval had become an addiction she couldn't break. And as Aunt Monica's eyes bored into her, waiting for her to apologize, Savannah felt the cold truth sink in. She'd been complicit in her own suffering, trapped in a psychological trap she hadn't even realized she was in. Savannah stood there in the kitchen, the sharp scent of lemons still lingering in the air, but it wasn't the food she was focused on anymore. It was Monica's words, the same words she had heard for years. "Don't be so transactional," Monica had said, and for the first time, Savannah didn't just feel the sting of guilt. She felt something different, a slow, creeping awareness. Something was shifting in her, like the sudden realization that she had been living her life on autopilot, responding to the same manipulations without even thinking. She had been trained to obey. It wasn't love that had kept her here, chasing approval and giving up pieces of herself for the sake of others. It wasn't kindness. It was a drug she had been addicted to since she was a child. The approval of her father, the constant need to earn his favor to be enough. For so long, she had believed that this was just part of being a good daughter, of being a kind person. But now, standing in the sterile kitchen of her mother's estate, with Monica's condescending gaze locked on her, the fog began to lift. This wasn't kindness. It was submission. It was survival. Savannah remembered the countless times she had sat at the dinner table, watching her father with quiet desperation, hoping he would notice her, that he would acknowledge her worth. She could almost hear his voice in her head, now the way it always sounded when he was pleased with her distant cold, but with the faintest hint of approval. But that approval was never freely given. It was always earned, and it was always temporary. Every moment of praise had come with a price. Every time she had done something to please him, she had given away a piece of herself. Every time she had done what he wanted, she had been trained to believe that it was the only way to survive. Over the years, she had convinced herself that her need for his approval was natural, that it was just part of being his daughter. But as the weight of Monica's judgment pressed down on her, the truth became undeniable. She wasn't here because she loved him. She wasn't here because she wanted to be a good daughter. She was here because she had been conditioned to think her worth depended on her ability to perform, to serve, to remain small and invisible. She had allowed herself to be reduced to a tool to be treated as an object of utility rather than a person deserving of respect. The thought hit her like a wave washing over her with the force of everything she had ever denied. She had been addicted to his approval for as long as she could remember. She had lived her life in a constant state of waiting for him to give her the one thing she craved: recognition. But the recognition had always been conditional, and so had her love for him. It wasn't pure. It was transactional. She had learned to perform for him, to submit to his every whim in exchange for scraps of affection, and the more she did it, the more she became numb to her own needs, to her own desires. In that moment, something shifted in Savannah. The suffocating weight of the past 28 years, the guilt, the submission, the constant striving for approval, finally felt like a cage. But the bars of that cage were made of her own beliefs, her own actions. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't trapped by fate or circumstance. She'd allowed herself to be manipulated, allowed herself to believe that her value was something she had to earn through obedience. But that was about to change. She wasn't going to beg for his approval anymore. She wasn't going to sacrifice herself for a man who would never see her for who she truly was. Savannah lifted her head, her grip on the knife loosening as her thoughts cleared. For the first time in a long time, she saw herself, truly saw herself, not as his daughter, not as the person who had to shrink and comply to be loved, but as someone who had a life to live on her own terms. The truth was simple, but it felt revolutionary. She didn't need him. And it was time to take control of her life, her career, and her future. No more pleasing, no more performing. She was done waiting for his approval. She was done playing by his rules. It was time for Savannah to step into her own power. And the first step was taking back what was hers, starting with the life she had built for herself. As Savannah moved through the kitchen, preparing the food with precision, a sense of calm washed over her. The sharp knives, the delicate arrangements, the rhythm of it all, it had always been her sanctuary. But today it was different. She wasn't just preparing appetizers or setting out truffles. She was setting the stage for something bigger. Her mind was focused, every action measured as if each step was a part of a carefully planned blueprint. The years of emotional manipulation, the guilt trips, the endless demands, she was done with all of it. She had been trained to obey, to submit, but no longer. As the last of the hors d'oeuvres were arranged, she felt something shift within her. The cold detachment had already settled in. No longer the daughter trying to please, no longer the person desperate for approval. She was now just a professional doing a job. And this job came with a price. She hadn't realized how much she had been willing to let slide over the years until now. But with each task, with each meticulously plated dish, her resolve hardened. The guests arrived in a fleet of black SUVs, stepping out into the snow like they were above it all, dressed in furs and designer boots. Their eyes, never even glancing in her direction. She moved through the grand foyer, tray in hand, invisible once more. But this time, something inside her didn't care. It was no longer about blending in, about being seen or unseen. She was simply doing her job, no strings attached. She passed Richard, who was holding court by the fireplace, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch. He was telling a story about sourcing the vintage Cabernet, lying as always, boasting about how he had it flown in. She gripped the tray tighter, feeling the anger simmer beneath the surface. Richard wasn't just taking credit for the wine. He was taking credit for her work, her taste, her effort, and worst of all, he was taking credit for her money. She had driven for hours, spent thousands of dollars on that wine, and now he was turning it into a performance. The anger was there, but it didn't consume her. It didn't take over. Instead, she let it fuel her decision. When Elena approached, her gaze sweeping over the room like she was assessing a piece of property, the insult came swiftly. "Richard, darling," she said, "I thought you said your daughter was coming. I was hoping to meet her." The room fell silent, every eye now on Savannah. This was the moment, the one she had feared for years. She was poised for something she had anticipated in silence, but when Richard opened his mouth, it wasn't the defense she had hoped for. "Oh, that's her," he said loudly, pointing at her like she was nothing more than an object. "She's helping out today. Poor thing is struggling a bit with her little party planning business in the city. I told her she could work off some debt by handling the service. We try to help family where we can, right?" The guest chuckled, that polite, patronizing laugh that made her skin crawl. She didn't flinch. She didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't even react. She didn't need to. In that moment, Savannah understood something vital. This wasn't her battle anymore. She wasn't the little girl trying to be seen. She was the one in control. And as Richard continued to speak, not even realizing that he was playing into her hands, she made her decision. She wasn't going to react with anger. She wasn't going to show him that it hurt. No. This time she was going to act with cold, calculated precision. She was going to audit the account, a debt that had been building for years, and it was time to collect. The shift had begun. Savannah wasn't just playing the part of the help anymore. She was the one in charge, and Richard had no idea what was coming. Savannah moved through the kitchen with a focus that felt almost surgical. The anger, the years of resentment, all of it was subdued. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming what was hers. The food, the wine, the luxurious truffles and prime steaks, all of it had been paid for with her own money, her own effort. One by one, she began to pack the items, the wine first. 3 cases of the vintage Cabernet stacked neatly on the dolly rolled toward the door. No haste, no hesitation. Then the crates of tomahawk steaks, still cold in their thermal packaging. She handled them with precision, every movement deliberate, as if each piece of food she took was a small victory over the life she had been forced to live. The truffles, the caviar, the artisanal cheeses, they all disappeared from the prep stations and into the cold efficiency of her plans. There was no drama, no outburst. The kitchen was silent, save for the soft clink of bottles and the whisper of her movements. In that moment, Savannah wasn't a daughter, she wasn't the help. She was a professional performing a task. There was no emotion in her actions, just the satisfaction of knowing she was finally in control. With each item she packed, she felt the weight of years of manipulation lift. The estate, her father's world, was no longer her prison. It was just another job, and she was walking away with everything she was owed. Savannah's journey wasn't just about reclaiming what was taken from her. It was about breaking free. Free from the expectations, the guilt, the constant need to prove her worth. As she sold the estate, started her own firm, and built a life defined by contracts rather than guilt, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. No longer was she bound by the strings her father had pulled for years. Her life now was hers, to live on her terms. The phone calls from Richard, the endless demands, none of it mattered anymore. When his number flashed across her screen, she felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just freedom. And she realized for the first time that a family didn't have to be a source of pain. It could be a choice. In walking away from the toxicity, Savannah found her true power, not in what she had given up, but in what she had gained. So, if you've ever found yourself trapped in a toxic relationship, whether it's family, friends, or anyone else, ask yourself, is it worth staying, or is it time to walk away? We all have the power to reclaim our lives. If you've ever felt that shift in yourself, share your story, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more reflections on strength, independence, and breaking free from the past.